Good afternoon. We're going to call the Assembly GO Committee to order and want to welcome everyone this afternoon to this informational hearing on the overview of the daily fantasy sports industry. Traditional fantasy sports have become a cultural phenom in the U.S. with nearly 60 million North Americans expected to participate this year. But more recently, daily fantasy sports has emerged as a new frontier and is certainly growing in its popularity. Major League Baseball, the NBA, the NHL, and the NFL have all partnered with daily fantasy sports in some fashion or another. Television coverage of the NFL now includes entire programs devoted entirely to fantasy football. In terms of market size, the daily fantasy sports industry is still relatively small. However, its growth has been astonishing, with estimates suggesting that player entry fees will soon exceed the total amount wagered annually on all sports in Nevada. Those estimates predict daily fantasy operators will take in $17 billion in entry fees each year by 2020. This growth and the attention that has come with it has sparked confusion around the vague patchwork of federal and state laws governing these websites. Lawmakers in Indiana, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania have already introduced legislation, while New York currently has 4 bills pending. And as fantasy sports continues to grow in popularity, more states are likely to weigh in. In California, we have the opportunity to lead the way and set the tone for how to balance consumer protections with consumer demand. Recent events reported by the New York Times have highlighted the need for action in this area to plug the gaps that currently exist in our laws. When the federal government passed the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act of 2006, they assigned jurisdiction over daily fantasy sports to the states. As the legislature, we are not here today to decide the legality of daily fantasy sports in California. That is a question that lies with the courts and our Attorney General. We are here to consider how and what safeguards can be put in place to ensure games are fair, to prohibit underage usage, to prevent compulsive play, to guard against identity theft, and to ensure consumers are competing on a level playing field. It is with these goals in mind that we convene this hearing. Today we will discuss the evolution of daily fantasy sports and where that evolution is likely to take the industry next. Legislative Counsel will provide an overview of the relevant laws and oversight authority. We will hear from the operators of daily fantasy sports sites, as well as from former Attorney General of Massachusetts, Martha Coakley, about the issues and challenges facing their industry. Representatives from professional sports will discuss the interplay between their teams and these sites. We'll also hear from the players themselves and get their perspective as the consumers of this product. We will finally conclude with comments from the public. With that, let's begin. I would like to first call up the first panel, the background and overview of daily fantasy sports. So if you would please approach, we'll go ahead and begin with your testimony. Thank you for joining us, and if I believe Mr. Grove is going to speak first.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Chris Grove, and I am a senior consultant to Eilers Research, a company headquartered in Anaheim Hills, California, that provides research and intelligence services to the global gaming industry. I'd like to thank both the committee and the staff for extending the invitation to testify today. My testimony will focus on 4 areas. First, a brief background on fantasy and daily fantasy sports. Second, a survey of the industry as it stands today. Third, an analysis of the near-term outlook for the daily fantasy sports industry. And finally, a consideration of some of the likely impacts and outcomes should California choose to regulate daily fantasy sports. Let's start with some brief background. While the root concept underpinning fantasy sports, hypothetical repackaging of real-world sporting events, is likely nearly as old as organized sports itself, The origins of the modern statistics-driven fantasy sports league are generally traced back to the late 1970s and the birth of rotisserie baseball. Fantasy sports remained a relatively niche activity until the 1990s, when two forces fundamentally reshaped the product. The first was the mainstream advent of personal computers, which introduced a transformative level of automation to the process of collecting and synthesizing statistical information. And the second was the spread of the Internet, which further accelerated automation, removed barriers to player entry, and provided the foundation for sophisticated league management and administration tools that allowed leagues to expand exponentially in size and complexity. Those two forces, aided by significant support from major media companies and professional sports teams, set the stage for a dramatic expansion of fantasy sports participation in the 2000s. According to survey-driven research performed by Ipsos and the Fantasy Sports Trade Association, 51.6 million Americans will participate in some kind of fantasy sports activity in 2015. Daily fantasy sports, or DFS, followed a similar, albeit compressed, trajectory. The launch of the first daily fantasy sports site is generally traced back to 2007, and the product remained on the margins until 2012, which saw the first injections of significant external funding into the industry and the start of what would come to be an industry-defining rivalry between DraftKings and FanDuel. That funding and that competition drove an escalating battle for customer acquisition that reached a peak in 2015, a year in which DFS sites, primarily DraftKings and FanDuel, reportedly raised over $800 million in funding and subsequently spent the lion's share of that funding on marketing. That marketing blitz included an estimated $107 million in television ad spend between DraftKings and FanDuel in September 2015 alone, campaigns that vaulted the product and the brands into the cultural consciousness and onto the radar of policymakers and law enforcement. But what exactly is daily fantasy sports? The question is more complicated than it might appear at first. There are a few standards dictating what a daily fantasy sports product is or must be. The nascent nature of the industry and the general lack of regulatory influence both contribute to a world in which a broad spectrum of distinct products operate under the daily fantasy sports label. In fact, it is arguably more correct to think of daily fantasy sports as a class of product, like table games or slot machines, that contain several discrete iterations with some shared qualities. With that said, it is possible to make some generalizations about the product in the status quo, as DraftKings and FanDuel control some 90% of the daily fantasy sports market and offer a broadly similar type of daily fantasy sports product. The characteristics of that product include, first, limited duration. So a contest at DraftKings or FanDuel usually includes a slate of games that takes place over a day or a few days at most. Second, a salary cap model. Daily fantasy sports participants at DraftKings and FanDuel construct their fantasy sports lineups by using a predetermined salary that is spent on athletes. And all participants in a given contest work with the same starting salary. The pricing of athletes is set by the DFS operator, and participants then accumulate points based on the real-world performance of the athletes that they've purchased. And then the cumulative point total of a participant's lineup is used to rank that lineup against competing lineups. The third characteristic is these are peer-to-peer competitions. Participants pay an entry fee to compete against other players in a given contest and are not competing against a house team or a house-banked opponent, more along the lines of a game of poker in that way than a Las Vegas-style sports bet. The fourth characteristic is a host revenue model, so a percentage of the total entry fees paid by players, roughly 9% on average, is taken out by the operators, and that's how they generate their revenue. And the remainder of the prize pools are paid out to players in the form of prizes. The fifth characteristic is a focus on the big four sports. So the DFS offerings at DraftKings and FanDuel are primarily, albeit not exclusively, focused on football, basketball, baseball, and hockey. DraftKings does offer some niche sports such as golf, soccer, esports, and MMA, and FanDuel also offers esports. Finally, both are U.S.-centric products. DraftKings and FanDuel generate the vast majority of their traffic and their revenue in the United States. Both do offer their product within Canada, and both have signaled their plans for international expansion in the months and years ahead. Again, it's important to stress that what I've just provided is not a definitive picture of the complete spectrum of daily fantasy sports products that exist in the market today. Rather, it's a general sketch of the commonalities between DraftKings and FanDuel. It's meant to serve as an entry point into appreciating the contours of the dominant product, the dominant variant of daily fantasy sports. With that brief history in hand, I'll move on to an overview of the current market for DFS. DFS has enjoyed rapid growth, but today's market is substantially smaller than most people actually assume. Eilers Research estimates that in 2015, just over 4 million unique players will spend $3.13 billion on DFS contest entries, generating about $288 million in total industry revenue. These figures and other data referenced in my presentation are also available in a supplemental report that has been provided to the committee. By comparison, New Jersey's regulated online casinos and poker rooms, available to roughly 2% of the audience that has access to DFS, are on pace to generate roughly $145 million, just a little more than half of DFS, in revenue in 2015. There are dozens of DFS platforms, including products from major media companies such as Yahoo, and products from regulated online gambling operators such as Amaya and Sporttech. But the DFS market is effectively a duopoly, with DraftKings and FanDuel engaged in a neck-and-neck battle for the greater share of the roughly 90% of the market that the two currently control. Notably, none of the major DFS operators are understood to be profitable at this point. DFS operators have poured hundreds of millions of dollars into marketing efforts, but one particular marketing channel, professional sports partnerships, deserves special attention, both because of its unprecedented nature and sheer ubiquity. NASCAR, the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, and MLS all have league-level promotional relationships with daily fantasy sports operators. Add to that list 28 Major League Baseball teams, 22 NBA teams, 28 NFL teams, and 12 NHL teams, along with 18 branded fantasy lounges at major sports arenas dotted across the United States. Who's the target of all of this attention? A survey of DFS players conducted by Eilers Research, combined with data released by DraftKings, FanDuel, and the FSTA, paints a demographic picture of the typical DFS player that is almost exclusively male and Caucasian. The majority of DFS players are aged 25 to 35, are college educated, and have a household income of $75,000 or more. The third area of my testimony is a survey of the near-term outlook for the daily fantasy sports industry. At Eilers, we believe that the deep, multi-pronged uncertainty facing DFS undermines any credible attempt at specific projection. That uncertainty has already resulted in Eilers Research revising our industry-wide revenue outlook for 2015 from $3.7 billion in September to $3.13 billion today. So rather than offer specific revenue and user projections that may be rendered irrelevant by tomorrow's headlines, I will identify 4 key pressure points likely to shape DFS participation and revenue in the near term. 1, the cost of compliance. Major DFS operators have recently been left with little choice but to onboard sophisticated systems for key compliance functions like geolocation and know your customer. These systems are both expensive and inject significant friction into the customer acquisition process and the overall customer experience. The collective weight of those costs will become more apparent in 2016. The second pressure point, dueling state strategies. States are considering a variety of approaches to DFS, ranging from light regulatory schemes that would add little overhead for operators to full-blown regulation with 7-figure license fees. Lurking on the fringe is the possibility that other states will follow the example of Nevada and New York and aim for some flavor of prohibition. The third pressure point is decreased marketing firepower. The impressive growth managed by DFS in 2015 was fueled at least in part by a staggering ad spend. The ability of DFS sites to maintain momentum via marketing in 2016 will be tested by increased legal costs, new lobbying costs, existing marketing obligations, and a challenging to impossible fundraising environment. And the fourth pressure point is the resolution of federal probes. Even the suggestion of an adverse development in one of the two reported federal probes of the DFS industry could trigger a cascade of events that would dramatically and immediately reshape the landscape. I'll finish my testimony with a few notes regarding the potential for daily fantasy sports regulation in California. I'll start with some context. In 2015, Eilers Research estimates that 400,000 unique paying players from California will pay roughly $357 million in entry fees to daily fantasy sports sites, generating approximately $33 million in revenue industry-wide. It's unclear at this point what approach will be taken to taxation should California regulate DFS. In the absence of an existing proposal, I prepared three simple taxation scenarios. The first is based on how New Jersey taxes regulated online gambling. The second is based on proposed tax treatment for regulated online poker in California. And the final one blends the California online poker tax approach with the federal excise tax applied to regulated sports wagering. The details of each model are available in the supplemental report that I referenced, but in the most aggressive scenario, which would be a 15% tax rate applied to gross operator revenue, California would realize just under $5 million in direct annual tax revenue from daily fantasy sports. It's important to further note that three factors could serve to significantly depress that already modest sum. The first is that a ring-fenced market will cut revenues. If regulation requires operators to carve out California from the rest of the market, we do believe that the result would be parts that total far less than the sum of the whole. The second is that regulatory costs may fracture the business model. Simply put, the viability of the daily fantasy sports model remains unproven. Significant regulatory costs could depress marketing spend, force operators to increase the amount they charge for hosting the competitions, or otherwise threaten the still nascent ecosystem underpinning the industry, especially if those costs are duplicated in a patchwork state-to-state regulatory framework. And finally, taxation itself may stunt growth. A DFS is not a mature product, and most operators are not mature companies. The market leaders are not profitable, reinvesting virtually all revenue back into acquisition and product development. Taxation, especially models that focus on turnover or gross revenue, may serve as a choke point that inhibits the sort of rapid growth leading companies and arguably the industry itself is more or less predicated upon. With that, I'll conclude my testimony, but I am happy to make myself available to the committee later in this hearing or at a future date. I'll now turn it over to Chris Krafsick of Gambling Compliance, who will shift the discussion to legislative and regulatory issues.
Good afternoon, members of the committee. My name is Chris Krafsick, and I'm Research Director North America at Gambling Compliance. We're a London-headquartered firm that provides independent business intelligence to entities that are associated with the global gambling industry. Thank you, committee members, and thank you especially to committee staff for inviting me to testify today. I wanted to start by offering an update on the recent and very marked increase in DFS legislative activity, as well as an overview of how states have begun to approach the question of DFS regulation through legislation and by other means. In 2015, Gambling Compliance estimates that 15 states considered legislation addressing DFS, up from just 2 states in 2014. In our view, that increase in legislative activity was driven by 4 main factors. 1, the widespread absence of legal clarity surrounding DFS. 2, the increased visibility of DFS advertising, which Chris touched upon in his testimony. 3, allegations of and subsequent media coverage of insider play at DFS operators DraftKings and FanDuel. And 4, increased lobbying by DFS industry participants. Further, it is our view that the factors 2 and 3, those again being the increased visibility of DFS advertising and the allegations of insider play at DraftKings and FanDuel, principally gave rise to the nascent but fast-moving debate about DFS regulation. Although no consensus timeline of that debate yet exists, it could be said to have begun in early September when a wave of DFS advertising ushered in the first week of the NFL season. It could also be said that that debate began to accelerate in mid-September when California became the first state to introduce legislation that would regulate DFS. It could also be said that that debate began to further accelerate in mid-September when a New Jersey congressman called for a hearing to explore the relationship between DFS and traditional sports wagering. Finally, it could be said that that debate began to markedly accelerate in early October 2015 when media coverage of the DraftKings, FanDuel, insider play allegations thrust questions about DFS regulation into the national spotlight. While researchers will eventually assemble a definitive record of the events that sparked the DFS regulatory debate, it is striking that since early September, 5 states, California, Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, and New York, have introduced legislation that would subject DFS operators to some form of regulation. 2 states, Washington and Pennsylvania, have released draft or discussion versions of such legislation. 1 state, Massachusetts, has promulgated draft DFS regulations. 1 state, Nevada, has declared that DFS is a form of gambling that requires licensure. And 1 state, New York, has taken enforcement action against DFS operators on grounds that DFS is a form of illegal gambling. California, therefore, finds itself in the vanguard of states that have begun to address the question of DFS regulation. To help orient you to DFS regulation and how it's unfolding in the U.S., I wanted to briefly outline the approaches that other states have proposed. The first approach, which we have loosely termed as carve-out, is one under which DFS would be expressly exempted from a state's gambling prohibitions. Notably, under that approach, DFS operators would not be subjected to regulation. So far this year, 5 states, Iowa, Michigan, Louisiana, New York, and Washington, have considered carve-out legislation, while 1 state, Kansas, has enacted such legislation. The second approach, which we have loosely termed light regulation, is one under which DFS operators would be required to largely self-regulate in accordance with certain minimum standards. Under that approach, DFS operators may also be required to pay certain fees. For perspective, minimum standards proposed in other states include those that would require DFS operators to prohibit DFS play by their employees, those that would require DFS operators to implement systems to verify that DFS players are of a certain age, and those that would require DFS operators to provide responsible gaming options to DFS players, including the option to self-exclude from DFS play. So far this year, 3 states, Illinois, Florida, and New Jersey, have considered light regulation legislation, while 1 state, Massachusetts, has promulgated draft light regulations. The third approach, which we have loosely termed heavy gambling-style regulation, is one under which DFS would be subjected to regulation by a state gaming commission or a state lottery. Under that approach, DFS operators would be required to apply for licensure, to undergo background investigations, to pay fees to cover costs associated with those investigations, to pay taxes on their revenue, and to provide responsible gaming options to DFS players. So far this year, 2 states, California and New York, have considered heavy gambling-style regulation legislation, a mouthful. Notably, 3 additional states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Washington, have also released draft or discussion versions of such legislation. The fourth and final approach, which we have loosely termed prohibition, is one under which DFS would be expressly banned. So far this year, however, no states have considered prohibition legislation. Other less common approaches to DFS regulation that have been proposed, but that I will only reference in passing here due to time constraints, include study, under which a state would commission an independent study to assess possible routes to DFS regulation, casino partnership, under which land-based casinos or other land-based gaming entities would be authorized to partner with DFS operators, and lottery authorization, under which a state lottery would be authorized to operate DFS contests. As you can see, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to DFS regulation, nor is there yet an intuitive way to classify how states are approaching DFS regulation. And although the legislative and regulatory environment for DFS is and will likely remain very, very fluid, I wanted to offer a few big-picture thoughts on what to expect in 2016. First, Gambling Compliance estimates that at least 20 states will next year consider legislation addressing DFS, up from 15 states this year. Second, we expect that a majority of those states will weigh up whether to impose light regulation or heavy gambling-style regulation on DFS operators. Third, given the ongoing absence of congressional action on DFS, we think it highly unlikely, although not impossible, that Congress will pass legislation that in some way addresses DFS regulation. Fourth, and finally, we acknowledge that certain events, for example, federal enforcement action against DFS operators or further state-level enforcement action against such operators, could materially alter the trajectory of the DFS industry, as well as legislative and regulatory approaches to that industry. To sum up, in 2015, Gambling Compliance estimates that 15 states considered legislation addressing DFS, up from just 2 states in 2014. In our view, the marked increase in legislative activity was driven by some of the same factors that sparked the nascent but fast-moving debate about DFS regulation. Secondly, as that debate has accelerated, a small but growing number of states, including California, have begun to propose approaches to DFS regulation, namely light regulation and heavy gambling-style regulation. Under the light regulation approach, DFS operators again would be required to largely self-regulate in accordance with a set of minimum standards. Under the heavy gambling-style regulation approach, by contrast, DFS operators would be subjected to regulation by a state gaming commission or a state lottery. In 2016, we estimate that at least 20 states will consider legislation addressing DFS, up from 15 states in 2015, and that a majority of those states will weigh up whether to impose light regulation or heavy gambling-style regulation on DFS operators. Still, we acknowledge that the legislative and regulatory outlook, again, for DFS is very, very fluid, and that certain events, for example, federal enforcement action against DFS operators or further state-level enforcement action against such operators, could materially alter the trajectory of the DFS industry, as well as the legislative and regulatory approaches to that industry. Lastly, I wanted to mention that the data and definitions referenced in my testimony are included in a supplemental report provided to the committee. With that, I'll conclude my testimony, but I'm happy to answer your questions in the Q&A portion or at a subsequent date. I'll now turn it over to Rebecca Blitzer of the California Office of Legislative Counsel, who will shift the discussion to legal issues.